Okay, so now we're going to have a look at the 5F4 lines of the Tarrasch. Let's just get to the position. E4, E6, D4, D5, Knight D2, Knight F6, E5, Knight from F to D7, and F4. I mean, White can actually play C3 first if he wants, C3, C5 and F4, but F4. Now, these lines are not actually that common. They come up every now and then. I've faced it a few times, and there's quite a few ways Black can play against these lines. I'm going to show you one of the most aggressive ways of playing against it. Just like I have throughout the DVD, I'm just looking for the lines where Black has the greatest winning chances. White's just going to try and build up a big position on the king side, trying to secure his centre really early. And Black's going to have to be very accurate to try and break it down. The main problem for Black in this position is this bishop on c8 can get quite bottled up, and it can be quite hard for Black to get that bishop into the game. And if Black's not careful, then he can end up in a bad position because White's king side becomes, White's complete control of the king side. So what Black has to do is he has to try and break that centre down, which often involves moves like c5, f6, sometimes even g5, and just trying to, chip away at the White centre. All the standard French moves, a lot of the ideas are going to come up in a lot of different variations, same sort of ideas. So if you can remember the main plans, then you don't need to remember all the hard theory. You can probably work out good moves. But there are some tactical lines, so you're going to have to be careful in the F4 Tarrasch. So anyway, after F4, Black plays C5, and then White plays C3, Knight C6, and the main lines go Knight DF3. We'll cover the sidelines in another chapter. So after Knight DF3, the move which I'm going to recommend here is Queen B6, just trying to put instant pressure on the centre. Now, after Queen B6, one of the main ways of playing is this move A3, and this is a line which has caused Black some trouble, I think, over the years, and it looked like it was quite a good system for White, but I think Black's come up with a really good solution now. Black players have worked out the best way to play against that. And that's just to continue with Bishop E7. So in general, most of these lines we could do in Bishop E7, and we're thinking about F6 at some point. But here, Bishop E7, and the main idea of A3 is, of course, White wants to play B4. And now what we do is we have to change our approach. We don't go for this F6 move now. Instead, what we do is we take on D4. Remember, we never really take on B4 because that allows A takes B4, which we don't want to allow. So we take on D4, C takes D4, and now we play this move A6. And I think A6 is a really strong move. The general plan is that we're going to go Queen C7, B5, and then just stick our knight on C4 against pretty much everything. And it looks like Black's just doing fine after that. So A6, there's one game here, Howell against Robson, went H4, Queen C7, Bishop D2, B5, just carrying on with the plan, same as usual. Knight E2, Knight to B6, Knight C1, and then Knight C4. Knight D3, and now Black actually tried to play A5 and just take over the initiative on the queen side. And I think Black's just doing very well here. Knight C5, castles. There's certainly no problems at all. I guess the only piece you need to be a little bit concerned about is this bishop. And, we'll just show a couple more moves. So Bishop D3, and this is quite an important point because one of White's main ideas now is that he's looking to set up a Greek gift-style sacrifice. I don't know whether it works or not, but it's something I'd be very scared of. So Black played H6, just taking that off the cards. And after H6, White played Bishop C3. And I'll just show a couple more moves because it gets important now. Just quite thematic moves. F6, that's our standard move. We want to take on E5 and activate all our pieces. So F6 and White played King E2. And now in this position, Black played Rook to B8. And I'm not sure if that's the best move or not. I think probably best is just to play F takes E5. And after F takes E5, something like, well, I don't know what it takes Black. So F takes E5. Then Black's got quite good attacking chances in this position. You might even consider something like Bishop takes C5. And trying to open up a diagonal really to get this light square bishop into the game. I mean, if D takes C5, you might try and go Bishop B7 and D4. I guess if B takes C5, you try and play for B4. And if Black can get that bishop into the game, then probably it's just a lot better for Black. So I think this position is generally very good for Black. So going back to the main lines, after a3, just a simple plan against pretty much everything, just to go bishop e7, and then as soon as they go b4, you just gotta take on d4, and then a6, queen c7, b5, and knight b6, and just put the knight on c4. I think it's a very good plan against a3. So instead of a3 after queen to b6, another main move is knight e2. We're going to look at knight e2 and g3 as the other two main lines, and they do sort of transpose in quite a few different situations. So knight e2. I'm going to recommend bishop e7 here. Like f6 is a decent move as well. I actually won a game against Lupulescu, a really strong, I think it's a Romanian player, with a move f6, and I'll probably leave that in the notes, but bishop e7 is the move I'm going to recommend. Just keeping open the options, but generally you're going to probably castle and go f6 in a lot of positions anyway. So bishop e7, g3, and then castles. And now bishop h3, c takes d4, c takes d4, and here comes what is probably quite a surprising move. Can you work out what you think black should play in this position? Well, if you've been watching any of these chapters so far, you know the move that black's trying to get in is the move f6, and in this position he just plays it anyway. Even though the e6 pawn's on pre with check, f6 is still the right move because you're trying to break down the white centre. So bishop takes e6 check, and then king h8. And, well, black's got some counter threats now of maybe knight takes e5, sort of intermediate move, so that if bishop takes bishop, knight takes knight check. And also some ideas of f takes e5, so it's got quite a lot of attacking plans here. So e takes f6 is the main move. I think bishop takes d5 is probably not a great move. Black can probably look to play the standard kind of sacrifice, and I think I might have covered that in another line, and get some huge play against the white king. So instead of that, we'll just go back to the position after bishop takes e6, king h8, e takes f6 is the main move, and then knight takes f6. And okay, white is a pawn up, but black's got just like loads of play, so in fact, instead of knight takes f6, well, knight takes f6 is a pretty good move, it's probably the main line. It might be even better to just throw bishop b4 check in first. I think maybe bishop b4 check, just a tiny bit more accurate, before white gets a chance to move his king. And then king f1 is the main line, and then knight takes f6, bishop takes c8, rook takes c8, king g2, and now I quite like the move queen a6, controlling the d3 square. Anyway, it's pretty clear to see in this situation that black's got loads of activity, and the light squares are all pretty weak as well, so although black's a pawn down, I just think from a practical point of view, it's got to be at least as good to be black as it has to be white. Okay, so let's have a look at another option, and that is after queen to b6, white could play the move g3. So g3, and black plays c takes d4, c takes d4. And now you've got to think quite carefully about what to play. A lot of players actually go for this bishop b4 check. I think I might have played it myself sometime as well. Just trying to encourage the king to f2, because it's very difficult for white to defend with bishop d2, because the d4 pawn is then on pre. White has to play king f2, but I've just sort of come to the conclusion over the years that it's actually a bit better just to play bishop e7 straight away, because it's not that clear where the white king is going to go anyway, and a bishop sometimes a little bit misplaced on b4. Not a terrible move, but my personal preference is to go bishop e7 and look to get the f6 break in with the bishop on e7, or maybe even the g5 break. But I just think the bishop's a bit better on e7 than it is on b4. So even though you can get white to move his king, you might almost be forcing it towards a safer spot, like the king might go to f2 and then to g2. And so it's not that clear that you actually want the bishop on b4. So bishop e7, and then, well, there's a couple of ideas. Like white can go king f2 now. I think if he goes king f2, then quite an interesting way to play is to go g5. Just remembering that this e5 pawn is a little bit unprotected because the queen is pinning the d pawn. So if we can remove the f pawn, we can just take on e5. And we almost always want to play knight d takes e5 in a lot of these positions. Quite often we play it as a sacrifice. So here we get to play it without having to sacrifice anything. And I think this position is more or less equal after knight takes. Well, it's a very messy equal. King g2 and then maybe just say knight c6. Knight f3 and then bishop d7. Black's got a variety of ideas. He can castle either way, really. He'd probably try and play f6 to get rid of that pawn. Maybe if he gets rid of the pawn, he could even consider castling queenside, and then once that pawn's swapped off, go for something like h5, h4, just try and open up the white king. But anyway, I mean, the position's just really open and chances for both sides. So White could go for this king f2 to g2 idea, and if he does go king f2, then it might be a good time to play g5. So, okay, instead of king f2, the main move is to play bishop h3. Again, just trying to target e6 and trying to slow us down from playing the move f6, but we would know that we were going to play it anyway. So castles, yeah, knight t2 is the sort of transposition to the main line. Let's just quickly look at one other option, which is king f1. After king f1, you can go f6. It's a pretty reasonable move. I've actually played this myself in a recent game, and I managed to win, but I didn't really get like enough compensation. I felt like the opening after he played king g2, and I just like took on e5 and just did the standard kind of piece sack, knight takes e5. But I wasn't like totally convinced that in this position I was doing that well. I thought I was actually a bit worse, and it was only because he blundered later on I managed to win. But it's still messy. So instead of that, after f6 and king g2, I think king h8 might actually be a stronger move. King h8, just so that if he takes on e6, it's not check. And then say White develops for something like knight e2. Well, now is a stronger time to go in for this line with f takes e5, f takes e5, and then knight takes e5. Because if he does takes and knight takes, well, that knight is not protected, so White has to waste a tempo protecting the knight, maybe knight d4 or something. And we can start playing lines like this and possibly e5. Okay, it's just a complete mess. I'm not really sure who's better, but it looks kind of dangerous anyway. So this is certainly an idea, just trying to play king h8, almost a bit of a waiting move. But you can see it's quite useful not to have the king on that diagonal. So queen d5 is not check as well, so you know it's not a completely useless move. So that's one way of playing, and maybe another way of playing after king f1 is even just to consider going f5 right away. That could be another potential variation, and I think Black's doing okay. For example, king g2 and then queen a6. We can just develop our pieces, knight b6 and bishop d7, potentially bring a rook to c8, and yeah, it's just an unclear game, but I think Black's doing fine. So instead of this king f1 idea, the main move is to play knight to e2, which transposes back to the knight e2 lines, which we briefly covered just a minute ago. So knight e2, and then after knight e2, let's just promote that. f6 is the move. Sorry. So knight e2, f6. Bishop takes e6 check, we briefly covered as well. Bishop takes e6 check already. Remember, king h8. Now e takes f6 was their main line, and we consider bishop b4 check to be a good response to that. If bishop takes d5 instead, then f takes e5, f takes e5, and this knight takes e5 is the best move. And this is a standard kind of sacrifice. We just have to always be aware of this knight takes e5 plan. So it takes, and then knight takes e5. And I think this is just considered to be good for Black, this position. White's not really got enough play. For example, if White tries to grab the knight, so he's up two pieces, well, that's just going to end in disaster because bishop b4 check. And whatever you block with, if you block with a knight, then we're going to go queen f2 mate. And if you block with a bishop, then we've also got queen f2 mate. So you can't take the second piece, knight takes e5. So instead of knight takes e5, well, you could try something like bishop f4. But after bishop f4, I think, well, just looking at the position, Black's just got a huge amount of play anyway. For example, knight takes f3 check, bishop takes, and bishop b4 check. And if something like king f1, then, well, we've got the bishop coming out to h3 as well. And this white king's just right in the middle, in sort of no man's land. It's just totally stranded. The bishop's kind of got pressure on it, the rook's got pressure on it, it's got no squares. And I think black can land the killer blow with a move queen c6. You know, pinning the bishop to the rook. The bishop's also pinned to the king, so white's just in a lost position there. So in general, bishop takes d5 is thought to be a blunder in this situation. And white has to really go for the e takes f6 lines. But I think after bishop b4 check, black's doing fine. Black's going to be a pawn down, but got quite a lot of play. So the move after 11 f6, which is thought to be the kind of the solution to the problems, is to move rook to f1. It's worth just noting that castles is not really going to be any good at all, because we can just go f takes e5, and then that pawn is, you know, you can't hang on to the pawn. So say bishop takes e6 check, king to h8. If white takes, we can always just take back with the knight, and the d pawn's pinned. So f takes e5, bishop takes e6 check, king h8, and if bishop takes d5, then e takes d4, bishop takes c6, d3 check, king g2, and queen takes c6. And just looking at this position here, after queen takes d3, okay, again, white's a pawn down, but from a practical point of view, white's definitely got a lot of problems on the light squares. You know, the queen's coming down, and we've got this like monster bishop. Sometimes the French bishop can end up being like really strong, especially when white gives up his light square bishop, or we somehow get hold of his light square bishop for one of our knights. Then the sort of traditionally bad light squared bishop that black has just becomes really powerful, and this is one of those positions where that could easily happen. So rook f1 was supposed to be on move 12 the solution to all of white's problems, but I don't think it really is, because after rook to f1 we can just continue king h8, similar to one of the lines we looked at earlier. So just generally bishop takes e6 now is not with check, and we can maybe meet it with something like knight takes e5. Probably just a mistake actually, bishop takes e6. So white might try to continue developing with, say, knight c3, and this is what happened in the main game. F takes e5, f takes e5. Another standard French sacrifice, rook takes f3, we've seen in other lines of the Tarrasch. So all the same ideas just keep coming up again and again. And if you just remember the main lines, you normally can just find the best plans. So queen takes f3, knight takes d4, queen h5. Obviously, white's got some kind of ideas of going queen e8, so black has to take a time to go queen d8. And that's just a matter of black getting these pieces into the game. If you can get these pieces into the game, then white's king is just wide open, and it's going to be all over. So now white should have tried something like king f2, but instead he went queen d1, which was a big mistake, and trying to attack for d4 knight. But obviously the knight just moved, and after bishop takes e6, white's just accelerated black's development, and white just got in a lost position really fast. Now it went d4, knight d5, and then knight takes e5, bishop takes c8, and then queen takes d5. And black's already just much better of the game when bishop takes b7, bishop b4, check, king f2, and now black didn't play this move, but probably the simplest win is just queen f7, hitting the bishop and hitting the king, picking up the bishop, and you can see that black's got a really strong position. So I think the main lines of the f4 Tarrasch, they are dangerous lines, and they end up in very double-edged positions where both players have got lots of chances. But I quite like this aggressive way of playing against it, going for queen b6. If I just quickly recap, after queen to b6, we generally got an idea. If white goes for a3, we're gonna carry on developing with bishop e7, and then bishop to e7, and then we're gonna go for this a6 b5 plan. So a3, bishop e7, and then we're gonna go for this after b4 takes a6, queen c7, b5, knight b6, knight to c4. And if white doesn't play with a3, if he does anything with g3 or anything like that, we're just gonna take on d4, play bishop e7, and then, well, we might go g5 in some positions, but most positions we're just going to castle and go f6, even if that leaves the e6 pawn on pre. And I think generally black's going to get a lot of play and a very interesting game.